He mothered his best friend, married his wife, became the stepfather of his daughter, and lived in his house. On Saturday, December 16, 2000, Michael Williams left his home early in the morning, well before dawn, with a boat to go duck hunting at Lake Seminole. The lake was about 100 kilometers away from his home in Tallahassee. Michael was a very successful businessman. He had a beautiful wife and a young daughter who was barely a year old. Michael was married to Denise Merrill, and the 16th of December was the couple's 6th wedding anniversary. They had planned to go on a trip to Arkansas, and when he didn't return by evening, his wife first tried to call him. But when she couldn't reach him on his phone, she became agitated and called several times more. She became even more nervous and made frantic calls to her family to inform them she was worried for his safety. Michael's best friend, Brian, and his father drove to the areas of the lake where they knew he frequently went duck hunting. They found him struck near a remote boat ramp. After investigators were called, a search began, but soon had to be called off after a storm blew in. The next day, a search party was assembled to look for Michael. Fortunately, his truck was found parked near the lake, but there was no sign of Michael. A helicopter pilot who took part in the rescue and recovery mission also spotted his boat lying on the muddy patch by a ramp not far from the concrete ramp from which Michael had launched from in the past. After recovering the boat, investigators searched the boat and found Michael's shotgun untouched in its case. They also discovered that the engine of the boat was off, but the gas tank was full. This was surprising and unexpected because if Michael had really fallen into the lake with the engine running, the engine would still have to be on and the boat would have to be running around in circle on the water until the fuel was completely gone. This made no sense to any of the investigators. Something else was unusual about where the boat was found. The weather condition that night was stormy, and by all means the boat should have drifted miles away on the lake, far from where it was found, if Michael fell over while he was hunting on the lake. There were many stumps of trees that protruded above and below the water level in the lake, and so anyone hunting needed to be extra careful. Searchers therefore assumed that Michael had hit one of the stumps with his boat and had fallen out and sunk into the depths of the lake. Since they didn't see his waders in the boat, they assumed he had them on, and they may have filled quickly with water when he fell and drowned when he could not remove them. Another theory investigators postulated was that since there were many alligators in the lake, Michael unfortunately may have been eaten by them after falling in. Nevertheless, if he was in the water they reasoned, his boat would float to the surface within 3 to 7 days, like the over 80 other victims who had drowned before him. Unfortunately, 10 days into the search, there was no body anywhere, not even one definitive evidence to conclude an accident occurred in the water. The search was later called off eventually. On the 28th of December, 12 days after Michael went missing, that is, just 2 days after the search for him was officially called off, Denise arranged for his memorial service. Michael's mother didn't give up on her son's search. She believed her son didn't drown in the lake. She took it even more seriously when she learned that alligators are usually very dormant and inactive during the winter months as a result of colder temperatures. When Michael disappeared, temperature had dropped to 8 degrees Celsius and the lake iced out to as much as 20 feet from the shore. In those conditions, it was highly unlikely an alligator had eaten Michael. Another investigator reasoned that even if an alligator had against all odds eaten Michael's body, portions of his body parts would likely be left in the water. It will be out of the ordinary for a full-grown man to be consumed whole by an alligator. A camouflage hat identified by Brian as Michael's was also found around the search area in February later that year, but the DNA test conducted did not show it belonged to him. Therefore, the search for him was called off due to a lack of evidence, including his wife's unwillingness to pursue the matter further. 6 months after the search was called off, a pair of waders were seen floating in the lake by a fisherman and were subsequently retrieved by a diver. They were reported to be in perfect condition with no alligator teeth marks. A friend who had hunted with him a week before his disappearance said Michael took safety seriously. He never had his waders on until he had reached a point where he planned to get out and start hunting. So it didn't make sense that he wore the waders while he was still driving the boat. He reiterated Michael followed a common safety procedure strictly to avoid the exact sort of accident everyone spoke about. His guns were always locked up in his office away from his family, especially because of his young daughter. Divers who were called to search the area his waders were found also recovered a lightweight hunting jacket as well as a flashlight from the bottom of the lake. Michael's hunting license was also found in the pocket of the jacket in a clean and unspoiled condition. So many people found it suspicious, especially when there were no alligator teeth marks or any sort of damage on these items after a presumed 6 months at the bottom of the lake. No moss, no algae, and his signature and name were clear enough for anyone to read. None of the items showed any sign of being in the waters for that long. The DNA test did not connect any of the items to Michael. So, despite all the doubts and probability of someone planting the items at the places they were located, a Leon County judge granted Denise Williams a petition to declare her husband legally dead. In his only evidence for ruling in her favor was the recovered items and the alligator theory. The ruling was unexpectedly against the standard procedure because in the state of Florida, it takes a waiting period of 5 years before a missing person can be legally declared dead. That aroused Michael's family's suspicion even further. They believed by all indications Denise was culpable and had a hand in Michael's sudden disappearance. They supposed it was true, but they had no evidence to confirm their suspicion. Dollars out of the total sum of $1.7 million. Michael's mother was devastated. She said God had told her when she went to the lake to look for her son that her son was neither in the lakes nor eaten by alligators. She resolved there and then to bring his body home by all means. She launched a crusade to open a criminal probe into her son's disappearance and took a lot of steps to initiate an extensive inquiry. She made telephone calls and put up a billboard and missing person signs. She compiled her notes into a book and had people post them on social media on her behalf, all in the quest to find justice for her son and give him a proper burial. Friends contributed funds to put up billboards and bought advertisements on the channels. She wrote 2,600 letters to the governor of Florida asking for help in finding her son. She begged for a thorough investigation, but they told her son had already been eaten up by alligators, so there was no need for any further investigation. Fast forward to the summer of August 2001, 9 months after Michael's disappearance. Denise confronted his mother, who had been trying to get publicity for her son's disappearance and had written letters to the editor of the Tallahassee Democrat, begging them to do a story about Michael's disappearance. Finally, a reporter doing stories about missing people in the Tallahassee area reached out to her and asked if he could do a story. She agreed, and he wrote an article about his disappearance in the newspaper. But Denise and Brian were agitated. She called her daughter's grandmother on phone and invited her home. right in front of the yard of the house. She yelled at Cheryl and said she didn't want to hear Michael's name or see his picture in the papers anymore. She said she was done, and she threatened that if she continued with any further investigation, she would not see her granddaughter again. In a very unusual and strange manner, 5 years later, Michael's widow married Brian Winchester, her husband's best friend, who sold the insurance policies to him less than 6 months before he disappeared. The couple went on to live in the same house where Denise and Michael had lived before he died. He also became his best friend's daughter's stepfather. On the 9th of January 2005, Cheryl's birthday, Denise went to visit her. Cheryl thought she would see her granddaughter again after a few years, but Denise and Brian went without Hensley. Cheryl was with Nick, her second son. Once inside the house, Denise told Cheryl the lies she was spreading about them had to stop. But when Cheryl tried to talk, Brian screamed and shut her down. Denise threatened she wouldn't see her granddaughter again. Nick told both of them that all they wanted was to know what they had done to Michael, but they left and promised them they would never see Michael's daughter again. Law enforcement became even more suspicious after the wedding. They asked her about Brian immediately after her husband's disappearance, but Denise said that he was incapable of such horrible acts. Further investigation revealed she had filed for the $1.75 million insurance money just 19 days after her husband went missing, while the search was still active. Despite the suspicions, there was no way for detectives to move forward as Denise refused to be questioned without her lawyers. All Sherry's efforts for further investigation was unsuccessful. For the next several years that followed the incident, she investigated the case on her own whenever she was not occupied at the daycare at her home, where she took care of friends and neighbors' children. Her efforts began to yield some dividends because in the late 2011, the investigative Discovery Cable Channel did a segment on Michael's disappearance. That helped her keep the case alive, and more people became aware of it. In 2012, she wrote over 200 letters to the governor asking that her son's case be reopened, but no help came. Then, on the 5th of August 2016, in a dramatic turn of events, something strange happened 16 years after Michael's disappearance. The Winchesters' marriage had disintegrated. They had separated and were almost in the 4th year of their separation, and their divorce date was approaching when Brian suddenly lost control of his emotions and was in a bad mental state. Jealousy arouses a husband's fury. The ancient Greek Epictetus said, "What thou avoidest suffering thyself, seek not to impose on others." In a simple man's language, it means that which you hate to be done to you, do not do to others. Soon, Brian was going to be paid back in his coin. He had stalked Denise for days and finally sneaked into her car one morning. She was on the phone in her car with her sister when he climbed out of the back seat of the car. He grabbed her phone from her and commanded her to drive through the route he pointed out to her with a shotgun to her rib. Finally, they were at the parking lots, but he didn't realize she was parked under a surveillance camera. He held the seatbelt so tight she could not escape from the car, even if she tried to. She cried and pleaded, but he screamed and told her not to attract attention. He said all he wanted to do was talk to her. He said he was not planning on killing her, but was done with his own life. He begged her to get back together with him because, according to him, he had lost everything valuable to him since their entanglement together. According to him, the final nail in his coffin was the loss of his 70-year-old son, who had left him to live with his mother after he went through his father's phone and found out he was seeing prostitutes. He even found the website he was visiting and the fact that the girls had been in the house where he shared with his father. He also found out his father was sniffing drugs from a text related to drugs. When he lost his son, he lost all hope. Denise advised him to turn his life around and submit to God because, according to her, he was once a good Christian, and that was the major reason she married him. She convinced him to see his father, Marcus, and talk things over with him. She also promised him she was not going to report him to the police. Finally, Brian calmed down and left Denise alone. He went to the back of the car and started pulling out items and stuffing them into his backpack. He brought out plastic bags, a bottle of bleach, a sheet, and a tool that looked very much like a hammer. He zipped up the bag, took his shotgun, and apologized to her profusely as he cried. After he left, Denise immediately called her sister Deborah, who asked her to talk to her husband, who was a police. Denise drove to the police station and reported the case because she feared for her life. This was the chance police had been waiting for after 16 years of Michael's cold case. Denise had just described a fairly simple case of armed kidnapping, domestic assault, and armed burglary that was corroborated by surveillance footage. The case was a relatively straightforward process to convict her second husband of armed kidnapping felony, of which the minimum term of imprisonment is 10 years in the state of Florida marital affair. The police seized the opportunity to ask her what happened to her first husband. They wanted her to implicate Brian so they could indict him for murder, but she whistled her way out of the question many times. A leopard never changes its spot. Denise got Michael murdered and married his murderer, and then asked the judge to give him the maximum sentence in prison when she gave her victim impact statement before the judge. Unbeknownst to her, Brian would sing like a canary in retaliation and more for a reduced sentence. He had agreed to testify about what happened to his best friend 16 years prior and Dennis's involvement in exchange for not being sentenced to life in prison for the armed kidnapping incident. As part of the agreement, he received immunity and will not be prosecuted for anything he said in his confession. It was a deal of a lifetime for him, which he grabbed with every fiber of his being. Prosecutors agreed to follow through with it because it was the only option available to close Michael's case and bring closure to his mother and brother. Any man who sleeps with another man's wife is stupid because he destroys himself by doing so. That was exactly what happened to Brian. He will get wound and dishonor. His shame will not be wiped away. Brian had eaten the sour grape and now his teeth are on edge. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison for Dennis's kidnap as part of the agreement. The conditions of the agreement were that he would lead law enforcement to where he buried his friend, and if he was caught lying in any part of his testimony, the entire statement would be used against him in the court of law. He would also be prosecuted for first-degree murder by his confession. So he had the obligation to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. This is how the story began. Jerry Michael Williams was born on the 16th of October 1969. He grew up in the north of Tallahassee. His father was a Greyhound bus driver while his mother ran a daycare for the neighbors and friends. He had another brother named Nick Williams. Their parents raised them in a double wide trailer and saved all the money they could so the boys could go to North Florida Christian High School. Both Nick and Michael worked at supermarkets at night to support their parents. Michael played football at school and also served as the student council president. It was in this school Michael Williams and Kate Thomas, Dennis Merrill, and Brian Winchester met. Catherine became friends with Michael in their 5th grade. Denise, Merrill, and Catherine met in grade 9. They were not best friends but were close. So Michael also met Denise in 9th grade. The school was a small one and they all knew each other. Brian and Catherine met in the 9th grade. They were both juniors in high school. They started dating and got married in May 1994. Michael and Denise also married in December of the same year. At the Florida State University, Michael studied political science and urban planning and worked at an appraisal group as a property appraiser. He was paid $200,000 annually, which was a good sum of wage. The two families would go out and eat together. They watched movies together. Brian and Michael would go fish hunting together, and Denise and Catherine would tag along. They also did dog hunting along the coast together. Brian and Catherine had a son named Stafford together in February of 1999. Denise and Michael's daughter Angela was also born in May of 1999. Brian was not a great husband. He spent a lot of time away doing hobbies and stupid stuff. One day, he found a note in Catherine's purse and realized she had been cheating on him with another guy, Gavin, a friend from high school. He decided to take revenge on her by engaging in extramarital affairs. Well, the four friends, Michael, Denise, Brian, and Catherine, started going out a lot to bars, drinking, and at one point they started having an inappropriate conversations amongst themselves. One night in particular, the couples talked about sex, and that night was the first night Brian felt attracted to Denise, and fire went off between them. In all their years together at school, he was never attracted to her. If Michael knew he was digging in his own grave that night, he would have nipped the sex talk in the bud. Sadly, the affair between Brian and Denise started that night in 1997. Brian began lusting in his heart after her seductive words and racy conversation on phone. He was captivated and there was no turning back. He lost all sense of reasoning. Then he stopped being intimate with her husband, and it bothered Michael so much, but he didn't know why she was so withdrawn from him. She stopped being romantic in any way, shape, or form with him, and regrettably, she stopped having sex with him during her pregnancy, and ever since. It is written that anyone who commits adultery lacks sense. Anyone who does it will eventually destroy himself. Proverbs chapter 6 verse 32. Brian and Denise grew up in the church, so this Bible passage was no stranger to them. On the night of October 13th, 1997, the four of them went to Floyd. When Michael pulled up the car on Tennessee Street, Denise and Brian jumped out of the car and left him and Catherine to go and park the car. Denise and Brian went down to the entrance of Floyd's, and that was the first place they kissed each other and made out. They were eventually joined by Michael and Catherine, who were oblivious to what was brewing between their spouses. They had their night out, and after, the couples went to their separate houses. Denise and Brian got on the phone together and spent the whole night talking to each other. The evil seed had been sown in their hearts, and it was already taking root. They had lots of sexual talks and had phone sex that night. They continued the next morning during lunch break at work. The ember of adultery had been fanned, and the flame caught up quickly. They met in hotels during work, and whenever Michael was at work, they met. Michael loved to work. He loved his wife Denise and his daughter, and so he toiled for his family, for their comfort and happiness. But quite frankly, Denise was not happy with that, because after they got married in 1994, Michael, being a workaholic, always went home for dinner and back to the office after his family had slept. Other times he would go to his office from dog hunting, a hobby he had adopted since his days at school when he was just 15 years old. That routine didn't come as a surprise, since Brian was already a third wheeler in the marriage. He knew everything that was going on in their home. Michael confided in him and Denise was head over heels in love with him. Anyway, she met up with Brian very frequently and was intimate with him regularly. There was no going back for Brian. Her tempting words dropped like honey in his ears and enslaved his mind. The fooling around was so bad that whenever Michael traveled with Denise on business, Brian would also travel to meet her privately to continue their secret and amoral behavior. Eventually, they started going on trips together. They went to beaches and other places, all at Michael's expense. Oftentimes, during work days, they met at Home Depot parking lots or behind Cassia College. They would leave their cars and either go to Denise's house while her husband labored away at work, or Brian's, depending on how long each of them could be away from work. Michael and Denise's house was off Meridian, not far from a church. Brian loved to park his car in the empty parking lot at that church. He would walk down a drainage ditch that ran from the church through the woods into her neighborhood and then walk the short distance to her house. They met regularly for about a year and a half before Michael's death. Once in December 1999, Brian had told his wife he was going fish hunting in Arkansas with a truck, but a female police officer called Catherine the same day from the parking lot of the church. The description of the vehicle matched her husband's, and the location was even weirder because it was alarmingly close to Denise's house. Catherine began to question her husband's motive for parking in that neighborhood when in fact it was supposed to be in Arkansas. Something was just not right. Brian's job was selling life insurance policies. He sold one life insurance policy to Michael right after they graduated from college between 1993 and 1994. Michael had at first had his mother as a beneficiary of the insurance. That was a $250,000 policy before he married Denise. In due course, he changed the beneficiary of that insurance to Denise. Brian knew about Michael's policies, whether he sold them to him or not, because he confided in him a lot. They were best friends. After Ainsley was born, Brian talked to Michael about increasing his coverage, but Michael didn't want to increase the policy. He tried to force him to get that new policy because by all standards, he was rich and having a larger policy in $1 million based on the income he was making was not too much. He had a $500,000 policy with a different company. At this time, Brian and Denise were neck deep in their loss for each other. Brian was aware of the $500,000 insurance policy with the other company, but he and Denise intended that Michael was going to drop the $500,000 policy and replace it with the $1 million policy he was proposing. After Brian's relentless persuasion and a lot of encouragement from Denise, he agreed. He got the second policy, an extra $1 million with Brian. Angela Stafford, a colleague of Michael in the office, lived in Florida from 1995 through 1998. Brian, Michael, Denise, and Angela all hung out together, but she never met Catherine. She had answered Denise's calls many times when the receptionist was too busy. She saw her photographs frequently at the office and had come to know her voice very well. She had overheard conversations between Michael and Denise on the phone at some point. The conversations were not the usual sweet chit-chat between a couple, but just more direct requests from Denise asking her husband about her needs and how her car needed gas, how he needed to fill up the tank, and how he needed to pick up some items for her at the shops or wherever. She would threaten that if he didn't do as he asked, she would speak to Brian instead. And because they were all friends, Michael didn't see it as a problem. Over time, Angela and Brian went from being casual friends to an item. When Denise became pregnant, Michael flew Angela in from her home in Hollywood, Florida, West Palm Beach for the weekend to surprise Denise with her baby shower. After the baby shower that night, Angela, Denise, Michael, and Brian went to a bar downtown. Catherine, Brian's wife, was not with them as usual. They listened to music, and had drinks. Angela and Brian became closer that night and talked a lot. Michael and pregnant Denise left them at the bar and went home while Angela and Brian stayed a little longer at the bar. He took Angela back to Michael's house later that night, but there was a noticeable change in Denise's attitude towards Angela the next morning. She thought she had probably done something wrong that made a once friendly Denise unfriendly. Well, since Denise and her husband were close friends with Brian and Catherine, she thought Denise's demeanor changed because she was too close to her childhood friend's husband. In the fall of 1997, Angela went to a Sister Hazel concert, a pop band out of Gainesville that came town with Brian. Brian and Denise were unusually very close at the concert. They were practically in each other's arms in the full glare of her husband, but Michael was noticeably intoxicated. That was perhaps the most bizarre thing that night. It was the first and the only time Angela ever saw Michael drunk. Michael and Brian went hunting together at a lake sometime later. Only the two of them were on the lake that day. There were cracking areas on the mud that could easily break apart with nothing under to break the fall. As they walked along the lake, Mike fell into one mud hole at one point. His friend helped him out. Mike realized after he came out that he lost his gun in the mud and went right back to get it out. Brian told Denise about the incident and said if he hadn't helped Michael, he would have disappeared and no one would have known what happened to him or where he was. As the month went by, the thought of Michael's disappearance pervaded his thought. The more Michael and Denise were together, the more they wanted to be together, and the more they griped about their spouses, and the more they wanted to be together. Everything went from bad to worse, and from worse to worse. Gradually, both of them started talking more about how to get rid of their respective spouse. Denise didn't want to divorce Michael because it was against her Christian upbringing, but she wanted to get rid of him anyway to be with Brian. They wanted to be together and nothing was going to jeopardize their quest for that. Not even Michael. Her biggest concern with the divorce was she had custody of Ansley. She didn't want her to have to go back and forth between two homes. Brian initiated a lot of the planning, a lot of the conversations and the execution, but overall the agreement was mutual. So over a year and a half before Michael's death, they discussed several options and alternatives of ways that they could get rid of Ryan. One of the options was to make it look like a robbery where he would be shot at his office since he worked a lot at night. Denise didn't like that idea primarily because there would be an investigation. Since they all used to go out on boats a lot and Michael owned one, another option they came up with was for the four of them to go on a boat ride into the Gulf. Catherine and Michael will be pushed overboard while Denise and Brian will find a buoy way offshore that they would hold on to. They will either let the boat sink or let the boat take off on its own. Just anything to make it look like an accident on the water, and the perpetrators would survive. Brian didn't want the mother of his son to die, but he couldn't express it since it would look like he was still in love with her. To avoid that scenario, he didn't push that idea further. The last option was that Michael and Brian would go on a dog hunting trip together where he would stage an accident on the water. Michael would drown and Brian would survive. In any case, his survival or death would ultimately be an act of God. In their depraved mind, they thought that exonerated them from being responsible for his death if he died. If they must do that, it had to be during the dog season. Since dog hunting could only be done during that season, and it must be at Seminole Lake, which was a lot deeper than other local lakes around Tallahassee. Another reason they wanted wanted Mike gone as soon as possible was his intention to discontinue the $500,000 policy once it lapsed. Denise had unfairly paid more without her husband's knowledge. Both knew Michael would notice that money was going out of his account, and for that reason they had to wipe him out for he shattered their hope and exposed their conspiracy. Brian and Michael had gone on a trip to Arkansas on one occasion during the period he was planning his death. He confided in Brian that he was unhappy because he didn't feel loved and supported by his wife anymore, as she hadn't allowed them to be intimate for a long time. You know, the longest distance between couples is the one spent on the same bed with neither of them talking. Brian was silently excited because he didn't want Denise to engage in sexual activity with her husband at all. He had also promised Denise he would not sleep with Catherine anymore. They would check up on each other to confirm if the agreement remained in effect. Michael was suspicious of his wife, but he didn't know what the matter was. With friends like Denise and Brian, Michael's days were numbered, and he had no hunch about it. Michael was too trusting of Brian. Little did he know that he didn't have his best interest in mind. They say enemies usually live in the backyard of a house, but betrayers and deceitful people are members of the same household. That was exactly the situation Michael found himself. Michael said he would move west of the state. He thought she was on drugs because he had seen money disappear from the account. She had been making cash withdrawals out of ATM, and this was used for out-of-town expense for herself and Brian. He didn't understand what it was she used the money for. He had also discussed this in particular with his mother-in-law, but there was nothing anybody could do to help Michael. The anniversary was on the 16th of December, and Michael had planned for them to go to another city to stay at the Gibson to rekindle the fire in their marriage. Denise felt pressured by her husband, whom she had come to despise. She didn't want to go on the trip and didn't want it to happen. Instead, she planned with Brian that that day would be his last day alive. The agreement was for Michael and Brian to go duck hunting at Lake Seminole, where he would eventually die. Duck season lasted from Thanksgiving until the end of January. They had only a short time frame for duck hunting. It was either on the 16th or on weekends. Denise was happy because she was not going to be involved with a lot of things other than to provide an alibi. They planned for this trip for a whole week before the hunting trip. Late in the night before the execution day, Michael called Brian from his office and told him he wouldn't go hunting because Denise had told him to cancel it. Brian called Denise immediately. His friend hung up and asked if she had developed cold feet at the last minute. He was not happy that they made plan and that he committed to it and that would happen. And then at the last minute she backed out. He explained to her again they had a small window of opportunity to do the job as a matter of urgency, considering the policy was ending soon. The anniversary trip was due in a week and duck season will soon be over. They met up several times during the week to discuss the matter at lunchtime as usual and concluded it was time for Michael to bid bye to the world. Oh, the power and influence these people had over Michael. The heart of man is truly wicked. Who can understand it? That the same hand that dips in the same bowl with you is the same hand that is plotting your death. What a world. It was on the 15th, the day before the D-Day. The plan was the same. Michael had volunteered to ring the bell for the Salvation Army at Walmart. Catherine and Brian planned to go out to a concert at Floyd's. Brian actually wanted all of them to go out, but Denise couldn't get a babysitter, so Catherine and her husband went alone. The plan was for Catherine to be drunk as much as possible that night so she could sleep all through the night and the next morning so that Brian would have enough time to execute the plan, get back home and meet Catherine's father around 10 a.m. in the morning at Thomas Villai Road to go on a hunting trip. That would be his alibi. Denise's alibi would be that she was at home with Ansley. The plan was when Michael didn't come back home, she would start calling her sisters and her dad from her house phone so that she could establish that she was at the house with Ansley. Brian and Catherine got home late from the concert that night. She did have a lot to drink. Denise and Brian also talked about the medication Catherine had that would make her sleep good through the night since they didn't want her to wake up early, as Brian was going to leave home early in the morning. Brian had arranged with Michael that morning to go hunting at a special secret spot. He had advised him to bring his waders with him. He believed if Michael fell overboard with his waders on, he would sink quickly and drown. That morning of the 16th, both of them met at a gas station near McDonald's. Michael had his boat tied to his truck. He drove and Brian followed over to the lake in his white Suburban. Before they started in their separate vehicle, Brian told his friend his battery was dead and there was no reason for him to call. He was paranoid about phones and Michael always called, since there was already a record of his calls. He didn't want any call from him as they drove over the lake. It was normal for them to talk to each other on the phone or even drove together, but he convinced Michael he needed to use his vehicle instead of going up together in his that morning. Lake Seminole was about 15 minutes away. Finally, they pulled into the landing and launched the boat with their waders on quickly. He knew where they were going and he hurried Michael up. The whole thing was taking longer than he anticipated and he had to be back in town early enough in time to meet his father-in-law for his alibi trip to occur. They headed out and there was a deep area about a couple of 100 yards from the landing. Brian knew it was a deep area. He pretended something was wrong with the motor of the boat or that the weight of the boat had a problem and stopped suddenly in the middle of the lake. Michael stood up from where he sat wondering what had happened, but when he did, Brian pushed him into the water. Michael struggled in the cold water and looked at his friend with a puzzled look on his face. While the motor of the boat was still running, Brian pulled away from him so he couldn't reach back into the boat. Michael frantically removed his waders and jackets to save himself from drowning. That area of the lake had a lot of trees and stumps that extended out on the water surface. So he swam frantically over to one of those stumps and held on to it tenaciously to keep himself from falling. A sudden overpowering fear gripped Michael as he held on. He didn't know what was happening. He yelled in a state of extreme anxiety for help as his best friend drove away. Brian also panicked and looked back. Michael didn't sink as he envisaged. In addition to his frustration, it was getting dark and he had to get back to town for his alibi. That wasn't his plan, but he had to finish what he started, otherwise he was toast. He got out his gun from the boat, loaded it quickly and circled closer to where Mike was. He aimed the gun at him and pow! He shot him. Light flashed from his gun. He closed his eyes momentarily because he didn't want to see what had happened to Michael. He turned back around and went back to where he was. He got to the stump and realized he couldn't leave him the way he was. Michael just refused to sink. Brian knew he had to cover that up. It was closer to a small unpaved ramp area a little further from the shore, so he steered the boat closer to where Michael was. He reached down into the water, grabbed Michael and dragged him in the water over to the dirty ramp. He left the boats and Michael behind and ran back to the parked trucks. He drove his truck up to the edge of the water and tilted the rear of the truck towards the water and lowered the tailgate. He pulled Michael, who was a little heavier than him, onto the truck. While he tried to carry him, he deliberately chose not to look at Michael. He put him in the back of the truck and pushed the boat back into the water water to make it look like the boat was out there and that Mike had drowned and gone. He didn't give much thought to what would happen afterwards. Brian panicked and thought about how he could get out of the area and cover it up. He realized that it was probably too late to meet his father-in-law at that point, but he tried to speed things up a bit more. So he sped back towards Tallahassee, but realized he wasn't going to make it in time for the meeting with his father-in-law. He didn't want to turn his phone back on to call him because he didn't want his phone to have any record of it being in that area. By the time he got to the carriage gate parking lot where they were supposed to meet, his father-in-law was not there. So he decided the best thing to do was to go back home and pretend that he had overslept and also make a phone call from his house to him to prove he overslept. Catherine was still asleep when he got home. He crawled into bed and called Catherine's father from the house phone. He told him he overslept and apologized. He didn't want to wake Catherine up because of what he had in his truck. He woke her halfway and said he was going out with the dogs for training, and then he went back out to the driveway. As he walked to the back of his truck, he saw blood coming out of the back of his tailgate and dripping onto the driveway. His heart nearly jumped out of his mouth. He rinsed it off quickly. He finally decided that he needed to bury the body near where he was staying. He needed to do it quickly and in a place where he wouldn't be found. He decided on a remote area, but he had no tools, and that spot on Carl Lake, there were areas there that had holders of mud. He thought when he got there he would take it out. He would take Michael and put him in one of the mud holes. He thought that would be a safe place where he wouldn't be found, but he had no tool to work with. So he went to Walmart and bought a shovel, a tap, and weight for training. With this, he could weigh his body down in the mud hole. He ran into Mike Phillips while he was in Walmart. The friend thought he was in a hurry because he was rushing to search for his childhood friend, but in fact Brian was hurrying to bury his best friend. He drove from Walmart to Carl Lake down to the end of the road, and he put Michael down on the edge of the lake so that eventually when the water came back up, that area would be underwater and it was hidden from the road. So he pulled him down to that area and started digging a hole. It was hard and exhausting. While he dug, he heard a vehicle coming from the road. He hid in the bushes and made sure everything was flat and no one could see what he was doing from the road. He hurried back to his truck as the guy drove up to go hunting on the lake. He chatted with Brian, oblivious of what he was up to. Brian only resumed his business only after the man was several hundred years away from him. He went back to digging. He was exhausted and beaten by ants all over his body. He wondered what he would tell people if they asked him where he got the bite. But for now, it was beyond caring. Eventually, the hole was big enough and he put the body there and covered it up. He made sure it didn't look suspicious as best he could. He still had a problem because his truck had blood all over in the back of it. He put the shovel in the back and headed to his parents' house to clean it up with a hose because it was the nearest to where he was and he had a large parking plot. He realized he needed a pressure washer for proper cleaning. So after he had tried to clean it up in his parents' house, he went to a car wash where he cleaned it as best as he could with the pressure washer. Brian's father called him as he drove to his father-in-law's house in Cairo for the Christmas party and informed him Michael was missing. Brian didn't want to be the one to find his body. He would rather somebody else did. So his father was adamant about finding his son's best friend that night, and they went to an area where they found his boat. They left it where it was and informed law enforcement about the discovery. Brian spent an awful lot of time at the lake monitoring everything that was going on, but pretended he was there because he was concerned for his best friend and searched like everyone Every single person who died on the lake was found except Michael. The fact that alligators are inactive during winter made it even more mysterious, and the statement that he got eaten by alligators was very unlikely. And even if that was possible, alligators would not swallow him whole without any evidence in the lake was improbable. This realization unnerved Denise and Brian. It prompted them to come up with a brilliant idea of dropping off Michael's hunting gears in strategic places on the lake in their perfect condition. Truly, the items were recovered as they envisaged after months of searching. Michael had gone there with a hat similar to a very peculiar hat Michael used to wear and planted it there during one of the searches on the lake. Denise and Brian were getting concerned that nothing else was found out there. They hoped if his waders and jackets were found, it will confirm to the searchers that he had drowned. Denise and Brian agreed that their phone calls and contacts should be reduced, and anything about Michael would not be discussed in and around the house for fear of wiretapping. They continued being intimate in parking lots like they always did. After a while, Brian only got information about Denise from Catherine, who visited to sympathize with her. He couldn't go because he was afraid everyone would find out about their relationship and probably start accusing them of murder. So things didn't go the way he and his co-conspirator had planned it. Things didn't go the way he and his co-conspirator had planned it, but he couldn't bring himself to tell her how he had killed Michael. Denise just assumed it happened the way they planned it. Because Michael's body was not found, it was difficult for Denise to claim the life insurance money. Eventually, Brian's dad, Marcus, connected her to an attorney because she needed to pay the bills. She got a death certificate within a year of his death. She filed a petition, it was granted, and Michael's death certificate was issued. Denise got all the money. 3 years later, investigators interrogated them, but both of them agreed neither of them would say anything about the other. At first, Denise allowed her daughter Hensley to visit her grandmother. Unfortunately, she found a notebook where Cheryl wrote about her suspicion of Brian and Denise's involvement in her son's death. From then on, she denied her further access to Hensley. After Michael died, Brian and Catherine became more involved with Denise and spent more time with her because clearly Brian wanted to be with her more. Catherine even had to tell her husband that since Michael was dead, nothing was holding him back from being with Denise. Although he never owned up to the affair, he knew Catherine was just confirming her suspicion. After Michael's death, Catherine had gone to Brian's office to get information on their finances as bills were sent to his office. She found a receipt for a personalized gold chain dated July 2001 in Brian's office drawer. The name Meridian was engraved on it. Meridian was Denise's nickname, the name that was given to her within the circle of four because she lived on the Meridian Road. The discovery was the last straw. She subsequently separated from Brian a month later on the 11th of October 2001. When Catherine and Brian separated, he had the house to himself. On one particular day in 2004, Angela, who was Michael's co-worker, and Denise had gone to the North Florida Christian School to pick up the kids. They met Brian and all decided to go out that evening. He picked up Angela and they drove to Denise's house together. Denise was not happy because her babysitter had cancelled and she couldn't go out. She tried a few more times to find another babysitter but was unsuccessful. She tried to persuade them to hang out with her in her house, but Brian reiterated he would go out with Angela and that if she eventually found someone to babysit her daughter, she should inform them and they will send the address of the location to her. That evening, Angela and Brian went to a gay club. After that, they went back to Brian's house and ended up in his bed. In the middle of intimacy, Denise walked in on them. She saw them and ran out. Brian got into his pants quickly and ran after her. Angela didn't know what to make of what had just happened. Denise's demeanor was what Angela expected from Catherine, Brian's wife, not from Denise. More so, Catherine and Brian were divorced. Denise was just overwhelmed with something she couldn't imagine, and she remembered the first time she reacted that same way a few years back. Angela was suddenly gripped with panic. When Brian returned, she asked him how Denise got into his bedroom and why she acted the way she did. Brian denied it and said it wasn't Denise, it was his ex-wife. Denise became a raging bull that night. She and Brian had a briefcase full of mementos and cards, notes, letters, pictures, videos, and all sorts of things. When she ran out of Brian's house that night, she went home and burnt all of them. What he didn't know at that time was that Denise also started cheating on him with Mr. Chuck Bunker, a colleague at work. Brian had sown the wind and had begun reaping the whirlwind. An African proverb says, "The stick with which a man whipped his first wife is sitting on the ceiling, waiting to be used on the second wife." Things went off the rails, and the center could not hold for both of them any longer. Brian's life had become a roller coaster of disaster. He felt Denise had dumped him for Chuck's, and he felt like he failed in everything. It happened that Denise and Chuck traveled to Atlanta together, and Brian knew what that meant. He wanted to confront her, and he went to Atlanta. He couldn't understand why she would turn her back on him after all the extremely wicked and cruel acts they had committed together against their spouses, more especially to his best friend. Denise's sister told him where she was, and he waited for them in the hotel lobby. Soon enough, they walked in and he confronted them. He told Denise to end the relationship immediately. The only way she knew to make Chuck understand the length Brian would go to get her back was to threaten that he could have him charged for insurance fraud. When Denise told Brian that was what she told Chuck, he was disappointed and asked how on earth she could let a third party in on that information. But she had to do it to warn her new boyfriend to stay safe. The enormity of what she had done turned on Brian, and he felt he was falling into an endless pit, but how much further he would fall was shrouded to him. So on the 4th of July that same year, he went to the church and heard a sermon about freedom. He felt he had been living like a captive in his relationship with Denise. She had sway over him. He lost his family, he lost his son, lost out on his son's life, and had taken his best friend's life. That day, like King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, his understanding came to his mind. Like James chapter 1, 14 to 15 summed up the situation Brian was in. It says, and I quote, "But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his desire. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. So be sober, be vigilant, because your enemy, the devil, is seeking anyone he can devour." He began to suffer the serious consequences of his own bad choices. He realized that after all, that he wanted the life he had with Catherine back, and decided to reconcile with her, although he still loved and wanted to be with Denise. You see, better is a dry morsel of food with quietness and peace than a house full of feasting with strife and contention. Anyway, Denise's relationship with Chuck soon ended dramatically due to some legal issues they had. Marcus Winchester, Brian's father, helped Denise through the breakup. Understandably, she got back with him. Love is the greatest of all things. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not envious. Love is not boastful. Love is not proud. Love honors others. Love is not selfish. Love is not easily angered. Love keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil. Love rejoices with truth. Love always protects. Love always trusts. Love always hopes. Love always perseveres. Love never fails. But in Dennis's case, love is impatient and ruthless. Love is deaf. Love is dishonor. It is self-seeking and easily provoked. Love keeps record of wrongdoing and loves evil. It rejoices in lies and love betrays. That was who Dennis was. After Catherine and Brian's divorce, he and Denise decided it was time for them to start dating openly. It was already about 4 years after Michael's passing. Her family did not fully support her decision, but finally she got married to Brian in 2005. Little by little, they became less anxious about law enforcement as time went by and nothing happened. However, Cheryl, Michael's mother, wouldn't allow the matter to die. She was Michael's mother after all. She pushed for a criminal investigation with Nick, and so from time to time, Michael's issue would be raised. He tried severally to talk about things a lot more than Denise wanted, but she just wouldn't talk about anything related to Michael's death. They usually didn't talk in the house. They would typically take a long walk out of the house and talk at the lake or a public place or anywhere they felt they weren't being monitored. They promised each other that neither of them would ever say anything because they knew the only way law enforcement would get them was if one of them talked. Brian was concerned about Denise if she ever got under pressure, whether she would hold up to it. Ansley, Michael's only child, was raised in a house with the murderers of her father while being denied the love of her father's family. She was told that Grandma Cheryl was crazy and would hurt her. She had no relationship with her grandmother since she was 5.5 years old. Michael's widow was arrested in May 2018 on her daughter's 19th birthday. It was a surreal moment when she walked out of her office with her hands in cuffs after 17 years of her husband's death. The jury found Dennis on count 1 of the indictment guilty of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, and on count 2, Dennis, the defendant, was guilty of first-degree murder. Denise was originally sentenced to life in prison. The first-degree murder was later overturned in an appeal by her attorney since there was no tangible evidence in the trial that Denise helped carry out the actual commission of the murder, but the conspiracy to commit murder conviction was upheld. Denise will only have to serve 30 years in prison. After spending some time in prison, she attempted to have a sentence shortened. She was denied and will have to finish her 30-year prison sentence. Michael and Denise's daughter was awarded all assets of her late father's estate and insurance claims. Denise was given nothing. Brian Winchester is still serving his prison term. William's body was found in October 2017 at the end of Dead End Garner Road in North Lyon County, 8 kilometers from where he grew up in the piles of dirt. 98% of his bones were recovered, all well and well preserved. The 2 DNA tests conducted on the remains of Michael matched his mother's sample. This was the end of a long investigation.